Next on stage is Mr. Mark Howell, partner and head of the sports team at Mills and Reeve LLP, and one of the world's foremost football lawyers. Mark will apprise us on the latest developments in international football law.
Like John, I'd just like to extend my thanks, obviously, to everybody. Part of the organising committee for having me here. It's a great privilege to be in Bangalore. It's been a long time since I've been in India. I was at the Commonwealth Games in Delhi, and I was there for a month. Today I'm here for 24 hours, I'm afraid, so it's a very different experience. So, as John has talked about, he's actually helped me with my first slide as to what is international football law. As I see it, it is soft law. So these are sort of rules and regulations set typically by FIFA, by the AFC, or by UEFA, where I come from. And really what they're looking at is looking at FIFA level regulations to see how federations and associations are governed. At the FIFA level, also looking at how matches are performed. So World Cup games, World Cup qualifiers, what happens on the pitch, those sort of things. But also they have regulations, the RSTP being the main regulation, which actually deals with an international dimension. So you're looking at what happens between clubs from one country and clubs of another country when they transfer a player between themselves. And you look at what happens to an international footballer playing in a different country. That's really what those regulations are about. So they are of less relevance to the domestic scene here in India, but hopefully as we go through, you'll understand some of the changes, some of the developments we've seen during the last 12 to 15 months, and hopefully some of them will resonate and will be things that maybe should be happening in India. So it's been a busy 12 or 15 months. We can see there's been a lot of changes already, and most of these really came from the social dialogue that we've seen in Europe. We've seen FIFPro, who are the World Trade Union of footballers. Back in 2015, they raised a complaint against some of FIFA's regulations, some of their laws, and said that they weren't EU compliant, so they're illegal. This resulted in what I'd call some accelerated social dialogue between FIFPro, FIFA, UEFA, the ECA, which are on behalf of the clubs. Some of they represented the leagues and other associations as well. And it resulted in 2017 in a cooperation agreement, which effectively got FIFA to change some of its long-standing rules and to make them, I think, more player-friendly. So we've seen now 3 versions of the RSTP being issued already. We've seen a brand new disciplinary code. This came out literally 2 weeks ago. It halved the amount of clauses and regulations that we saw in the previous code, which I think is quite a brave move. Typically when you see new regulations, the temptation is just to keep adding new clauses and new articles. This one went the other way and has actually streamlined things quite impressively. We've also seen FIFA issue, as of yesterday, a brand new FIFA Code of Ethics. Unfortunately, I didn't have time to read that on the plane coming over because I decided to watch the Avengers movie instead. So at least my son will be happy. So let's get into the RSTP. So really, these are the regulations that regulate the relationship between players and clubs in the main when there's an international dimension. And in particular, what we see is where there's disputes between players and clubs. I guess, as an example, you could have an Argentinian footballer who's playing in Turkey. And what the Turkish football club will think they've got is the new Lionel Messi. The reality is there's only one Lionel Messi, and he's playing in Spain, not Turkey. And basically, what typically can happen is that these players do not live up to their expectations. So clubs tend to stop paying them. And this is when we see a lot of disputes between clubs and players. So what does a player do if he's not being paid? Well, he might decide to walk out on that club. He would then go to FIFA using these regulations and would go to the dispute resolution chamber and would try and sue the club for compensation. Now, one of the changes we've seen here is that you can actually get basically the enforcement mechanism improved. In the past, if you went to FIFA and the DRC and you got a judgment against the club as a player, if the club still didn't pay you, then you had to then wait a little while, you had to then go to FIFA and complain, and then you waited a bit longer, and then FIFA would eventually take some action against that club and discipline them through the disciplinary code, probably give them a transfer ban, and then eventually, if that didn't work, they would take points off them. What we now have is that at first instance, the regime is already put in place. So we have this execution of monetary decisions put in the first award. So it'll say, club, you pay this player within 30 days. If you've not paid him within 90 days, there's going to be a transfer ban. And if you've not paid him within 6 months after that, you're going to lose 5 points. So that's one change that's come in that FIFPro wanted, to stop their players having to wait and wait and wait and wait to try and actually get some money from a judgment. The other thing we see is all about what's called Article 14 of the RSTP. And this effectively gives players the right to end their contract if they have just cause. So what you didn't really have in the RSTP before was any definition as to what's meant by just cause. So we now have in Article 14 bis a definition, or one definition of what just cause is, an example of it. Now in the past, in the commentary that went with the RSTP, FIFA said if a player wasn't paid for 3 months in a row, then that would be just cause for the player to leave the contract and go. Now, what Article 14 bis says is 2 months in a row. So again, an improvement negotiated by FIFPro. If you've not been paid for 2 months, then you give notice to the club, 15 days notice, and if they still haven't paid you, you have just cause, and the player can leave that contract and then sue for his damages. Now that can be important because it gives a bit more certainty to players. But what a previous edition of the RSTP did was it brought in something called the overdue payable mechanism, which means that if you're a player and you're not getting paid, you don't have to end your contract, because for some players, your contract might be the best contract you're ever going to get. You might be at the end of your career. For other players, you might not want to end your contract because what you're going to walk into is a legal battle, an uncertainty, and by the time it's gone through FIFA and CAS, it may be 3 years, sometimes even longer, before you can get any money for a breach of contract. So the overdue payable regime has been useful, it's been widely used, and it's quite quick. So if you've not been paid for a month, you can give the club 10 days notice to say, pay me. If they don't, you complain to FIFA. Your contract still goes, you're still training and playing, and FIFA will look at your situation and they will say, yes, there's no reason why you shouldn't have been paid, so they order the club to pay the player with interest, and they'll give the club a warning. If it keeps happening, then they'll put a transfer ban on the club, and if it keeps happening, they can go to the disciplinary committee and take points off the club. So they're able to apply pressure to make sure that footballers actually get paid. Now, some clubs got very clever, and they said, okay, we're going to put in a contract that you get paid on the first day of every month, but we don't have to pay you until 60 days after that. So they took grace periods. And the new Article 18 of the RSTP has closed off that loophole. Those grace periods are ignored. If it says you're going to get paid on the 1st of August, you get paid on the 1st of August. But it's not always about not paying players. I'm afraid we've seen lots and lots of cases. I've sat on literally hundreds of cases at CAS, and I would say nearly 100 of those have involved players suing clubs for bad conduct. So not paying them is one thing, but sometimes what they do with the player, so the Messi that's not performing to the level the Turkish club thought they were going to get, they sideline him. Okay, so they put him in they make him train on his own, or they make him train with the kids, or a combination of both. The guy playing in green there, Mr. Plaku, he was possibly the worst treated footballer I ever saw. He was called in by the owner of his particular club, and the owner said, you're not really working out for us. How about we just halve your salary for the next 2 years? And the player said, well, no, thank you. I think I'd rather just get paid in accordance with my contract. So he said, no problem. You're no longer training with the first team. You're training individually. And every day he had to start training at 7 in the morning in a park in one side of the city. Anytime he was late, he got fined. He then had to train again after lunch on his own, just running around a track where his trainer was just sat there reading a newspaper, having a cigarette. And then in the evening, he would either be handing out flyers to promote the club in the local supermarket, or he'd be training with 16-year-old kids. And this went on for 9 months. So at what stage does a player have just cause to actually walk out on his contract? It's fact sensitive, it's not known. He actually got 5 months into this regime, and he went to the owner and said, okay, I'm broke, I'll take half wages And the owner said, no, you just carry on. So a particularly extreme case. Now, needless to say, FIFA, when they heard it, and CAS, when it came to us, we said, yes, he had just cause, and he got his compensation in due course. But what FIFA have now brought into the newest RSTP is Article 14.2, and this deals with abusive conduct. So if clubs are abusing players, they automatically now can claim their right of just cause to get out of that contract and sue for their losses. The other guy there is Gregor Raziak. Again, he was out of favour with his club. His club asked him to sign a waiver to sign off half of his salary, and he refused. Instead of assigning him to the youth team, they actually just sacked him on the spot. So he took his case to CAS and said, they had no just cause to sack me, compensate me. But the club complained to FIFA before CAS. They complained to FIFA as well and said, this was a reasonable instruction. The president of the club said, sign this waiver, and he wouldn't do it. The president is entitled to sack this guy. Well, maybe in Cyprus, but not in international footballing worlds. So he then brought his case through FIFA, and it ended up at the CAS. But what was interesting about this particular case was he ended up in what we call the wilderness because of an article within the RSTP, which is Article 17.2. And what happens is, if you have this dispute, then nobody quite knows until it's been to FIFA and the CAS who's going to win it. So was the club right to say that they could sack him, in which case they could claim damages off the player? Or was the player right to say they had no right to sack me, and then he can claim damages? And the problem is, under Article 17.2, the next club he pays for is jointly liable for any damages he might have to pay. So he went to try and find himself a new job. He went to England and he was offered a job from Charlton, but then they learnt about this contractual dispute in the background and they dropped him straight away. They said, we can't sign you because we can't take the risk that you're going to have to pay compensation. He then went to Poland and he got a club there, and exactly the same thing happened to him. And by the time he finally got a club to take him, it was on really low money. He'd been on money up there and he was now on money there. So what actually happened to him is the trajectory of his earnings had changed. So for the next contract he'd get, he may go up, he may go down, but it's going to be starting at this level. He had dropped right down to here, and the next club he'd go to would be down there, if he could even get another club. And we thought that needed compensating. Now, typically the way, if a club breaches a player's contract, that you compensate them for that is you give them any arrears that's due to them at the time. You give them the balance of their contract that was still outstanding, their fixed contract, but if they've mitigated their losses, that mitigation gets taken off. And we looked at this and we thought, well, that's not fair, because their actions has affected him. So we used the specificity of sport, and we actually decided it was fair to grant an extra 3 months' money to him. Now, 5 years later, FIFA have caught up on this, and they brought in a modification to Article 17. So again, you can see that if there is no compensation on top of your arrears, if there is no mitigation, then the compensation is just the balance of the contract. But if you have mitigated, then you can keep some of that mitigation in certain issues. If the reason why you've walked out is because you weren't getting paid what was due to you, overdue payables, then you can get up to an extra 3 months' money. And if the reason was that the club have treated you really badly, then you can get up to an extra 6 months' money of your mitigation that you get to keep. Now, with most regulations, they cut both ways. So it's important just to look at the Article 14.2 again, which is the abusive conduct. If a player is guilty of abusive conduct against a club, then the club have the right to end the contract as well. And I was trying to think of an example of what a player could do that is abusive conduct, and this was probably the best example I could come up with, which was Tevez about 5 or 6 years ago refused to come off the bench to play against Bayern Munich. He felt he was too important a player to be a substitute. The season ended, and he went back home to Argentina, and he refused to come back to the beginning of the season. So what he was trying to do was force Manchester City to sell him. So I think that would probably fit within the abusive conduct. But I'm not really sure it's much use to a football club, because what are you going to do? You're going to sack him? Okay, you probably have just cause to do it. And then you're going to sue him for your losses. And you're going to say, well, I've got to bring in a replacement Tevez and it's going to cost me £30 million. I'm not sure Tevez has £30 million kicking around in a bank account, as rich as he will be. So it's not really the right idea to go and sue a footballer who of this sort of value. They did the commercial thing, not the legal thing. They just got him back. They said nice things to him. He came back. They played him a few times. They got him to the transfer window in January, and then they sold him for £30 million. So there are regulations, but they're not always that useful. A couple of other changes that are coming in. So we've already seen in the 1st of June a slight change to the TPO regulation. As John talked about, you're not allowed to have an interest in a footballer unless you own the registration of that footballer. It's quite common in some countries that a footballer who's signed for £1 million will have a clause in his contract with his club that if he gets sold in the future, he has a share of the profit. And that was seen as TPO until this change. The other thing we're seeing is we're bringing in the transfer matching system, which at the moment applies between international transfers. So you have to put details of the transfer, of the two clubs, of the agents that are used, of the new contracts of employment, the player passport. All this data has to go in. And if it matches, then the transfer can go through. FIFA now want this to be done domestically. So you can imagine now the extra data that FIFA are going to get hold of. Very interesting to those people this morning. FIFA are going to be very powerful with all this extra data at their hands. But also it should get rid of one of the issue that we've seen quite a lot of, which is fake passports. This was a case I was involved with where a Swedish team brought a player from Africa that they thought was called Fred, a centre forward, and he was 24 years old. He was actually called Tony, and he was 28 years old, but he was still a striker. Now, the difficulty for them was that, okay, they've now got a player that's a lot older, so it's unlikely they're going to be able to transfer him on to a bigger European team. They're also going to probably have a player that's going to be more injury prone, but they're also going to have to pay more solidarity compensation to other clubs because 4 other years of training is going to pop up. So hopefully this will disappear now. So overall, new RSTPs, 3 of them, really good. Still some questions to answer, really about the main one for me is what happens if it's the player that breaches the contract and how you should compensate him. But we could literally talk forever about Webster and Methuselah, so we'll move on. So a new disciplinary code has come in as well. Again, this is dealing with things like match fixing, doping, discrimination, safety at matches. An interesting twist. What goes on in a football match? We're used to seeing players being sanctioned if there's dissent, if they incite the crowds or anything like this whilst they're playing football. Well, now if they go away and get their phones out and start tweeting about the opposition and start tweeting about FIFA and things like this, they can be sanctioned for bringing the game into disrepute for what they do on their telephones as well. The match fixing elements has been taken off the ethics committee, and now there's a new sanction in there for a failure to report. So if a corrupt betting organisation approach a player and say, will you get a yellow card in this game in the 80th minute, that's now an issue that gets you a 2-year ban. Racism, we can see that some sanctions have changed. We now actually have the ability of the referee to abandon a match, which I think is really positive. And clubs or associations that get involved in this on a repeat version, they can now actually be forced to have a prevention plan put in place. But on the whole, what we're seeing is some really good benefits here. We're seeing a legal aid system for individuals who can't afford to defend themselves. FIFA are now paying to make sure that every player is properly represented. Hearings can be public where necessary, and there's now the ability to have plea bargaining and proposed sanctions just to make sure that we end up with a streamlined, efficient process. And the standard of proof is now comfortable satisfaction. Now, here's an interesting aspect of where you can have at international law one set of rules, but at domestic level another set of rules. So on match fixing in England, the standard of proof is on the balance of probabilities. So we look at Mr. Wood, who's there. He, in 2 matches in a row, got himself a yellow card, and there was huge betting on him getting yellow cards in those games. If you looked at the video footage alone, you could explain it. You know, the player was going around him, it's the last minute of the game, he hacked him down. But then if you went into his social media account, you found he had lots of friends, and those friends were the ones that had been doing the betting. And then when you got hold of his phone and you looked inside it, you could see there were WhatsApp messages between them. And then when you looked further, you could actually see that one of them had actually passed him some money, although he said it was for buying a car. But on the balance of probabilities, the body there felt that he'd actually been guilty of match fixing and he got a 5-year ban. If it had been comfortable satisfaction, I think he'd have probably got away with it. Mr. Lamptey, on the other hand, was a very interesting case where, if it's a CAS case, if you want to read it, he got, even at the highest sanction, he got himself a ban for life. He's a referee. Now, you could look at his 2 instances of giving away a penalty and giving away a free kick, which both led to goals, and you could just think, well, he's actually a really bad referee. That's why he just made mistakes. But actually, when you looked at the sport radar data, you could see that every time he'd made a mistake in the last few years, or if he was a bad referee, it just happened to coincide with a huge betting spike. So on the basis of that, it felt like there's too much of a coincidence, and the panel felt come to be satisfied to uphold his lifetime ban. So it's new days with the disciplinary code, but on the whole, I think the changes have been welcome and good. What next? Well, FIFA are talking about bringing in financial fair play. I'm not sure it's needed so much in Europe because the UEFA model has filtered down to most of the associations and is working really well. But even UEFA have felt that they need to actually look at their model and think about some changes. And I'm not really surprised because the FIFA model came in on the basis that there was a real financial problem in UEFA. And there was. Back in 2010 and 2011, the leagues between them, their top teams were losing 1.7 billion euros a year. A huge amount of money. These regulations came in and brought some financial sanity into the game. But what they've also done is brought fossilization in. The reality is that if clubs can only spend the money they make from ticket sales, commercial and broadcasting on players, the bigger clubs get all the better players. And therefore, they continue to win year after year after year after year. So if you're a Leeds United fan like me, we can't get a sheikh who's going to come over from UAE, put £1 billion into Leeds United so that we win the championship, win the Premiership, go into the Champions League and kick Man United's arse 5-0 in the final. Unfortunately, this will not happen until somebody looks at the system and possibly challenges it under EU law. Maybe the next case up at CAS is Manchester City. They certainly have the financial might. 4 sets of lawyers, I understand, are acting on this case. So we'll see exactly what happens. Now, one of the good things that's also come out of all these changes at FIFA is they've put together a thing called the Football Stakeholders Committee. So we've already seen some of the changes that they've talked about, but what we have now is a little glimpse into the future about what new international developments are coming down the road. So a clearinghouse is one thing they announced last week. This effectively means that for international transfers, the money will come through FIFA. Now that means that they can take the cash, they can then pay training, compensation and solidarity payments to the smaller clubs around the world that have actually trained and invested in young players that are now typically playing in the top leagues in Europe. So that's good. The domestic transfer matching system we've already talked about. Licensing for agents. John is absolutely right. FIFA used to license them. They gave up on this 3 or 4 years ago, maybe even 5 years ago now, and they really sort of pushed the licensing system down to each of the individual countries. So in England, they said to the Football Association, well, you deal with them. You deal with the agents in your country when any player comes into England. It's not working. There's too much inconsistency. So the stakeholder committee are talking about taking it back and start looking to actually license agents and intermediaries themselves again. There's going to be better regulations around loans. A lot of players go out on loans rather than full transfers, but also we see clubs, again, typically in England, I'm afraid, I see a few Chelsea shirts in the audience. Chelsea are the biggest proponents of doing this. They literally have hundreds of players that are registered to them that they never intend to play in their team or any of their reserve teams in this country. They get them in, they sign them, so they're hoovering in some of the best talent from around the world at a very young age, and then they put them all out on loan. They go in the shop window in many different countries, different feeder clubs, and if any of them make it, then they sell them and they make money on them. So I think this sort of warehousing of players is something that FIFA don't like, and this is something that they're going to look into as well. And then finally, they're going to look at solidarity contributions on domestic transfers. So if, for example, Mo Salah is obviously at Liverpool at the moment, if he was sold for 100 million euros or pounds to Liverpool, from Liverpool to Manchester United, there would be no solidarity payment to any of the smaller clubs that actually developed Mo Salah because it's a domestic transfer. If he was sold for 100 million to Barcelona, then 5% of that would be up for grabs for those smaller clubs to share out. So where's the sense in that? I think FIFA are recognising that really, if a player moves and he keeps developing and money is keep paid for him, then the smaller clubs should continue to benefit from them. So that has been a 30-minute canter through what has been a year and a half's worth of changes from FIFA. So apologies, I could only really scratch the surface, but I'm not sure if we have questions now or at a later stage. Later. Then thank you very much.